Welcome to our United Soybean Board Checkoff Chats. I'm Kellen Havikin with Brownfield Ag News, an anchor and reporter based in Nebraska. And I'm with Mac Marshall, who's with USB. Mac, today we're going to discuss a little bit about international markets for U.S. soy. First, before we get into that, you're well versed in this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I lead market intelligence for the United Soybean Board and sit on a team of other strategists on USB staff who work with our farmer directors to provide the best intelligence and strategic alignment. So when they're building their portfolios of investment to advance the soy industry into the future, they're getting to do so with full consideration of market dynamics and things that are unfolding not just now but in the future. So paying attention to the markets now is important, but we also got to be looking down the road too.
Well, let's focus on now and what's happened with U.S. soy. When we look at soybean exports for U.S. farmers, they've been fairly strong recently.
Absolutely. So I joined USB in early 2020, May 2020, and at that point, the U.S. and China had just a couple months prior entered into phase one of the trade deal. Now, we weren't able to really capitalize upon that until that fall. That was the first harvest that we had while phase one was entered into force. And since September 1st, 2020, since the start of the 20/21 marketing year for whole beans, we've had two very, very good years for exports, and where we are in this season in the 22-23 campaign, moving along pretty well also. So if we look back to the 20/21 marketing year, absolute record volume exports for whole soybeans, as well as the whole complex if you total up beans, meal, and oil together, which is important because of our crop, about 60% of it is exported in some form or another, either as whole beans, as meal, or as oil. So that 2021 campaign, over 61 million tons exported, over 74 million tons of all the major soy commodity products exported, so phenomenal. And then last year, while we came back a little in volume shipments, just due to unit prices being high, an absolute record for value of shipments, over $40 billion. The soy complex, the U.S., we are an export-oriented producer. We produce for surplus, but the soy complex is the most valuable U.S. ag export, and you really see that reflected in the data. So last year, real banner year.
Well, you mentioned how big exports were last year, but I'm curious, what's driving so much international demand for U.S. soy?
Well, so it's interesting. So if we go back to 2020, China has historically been the largest international buyer of whole U.S. soybeans. So when we had the trade war, that was difficult. But when you are in those difficult times, when you effectively lose your largest market, you have to get creative. You have to think about a diversification strategy. So our partners at USEC, the U.S. Soybean Export Council, who is our international marketing wing of the Checkoff, they really embarked on a diversification initiative, looking at other markets that were out there. Now, filling the void that was left by China during that time is quite a significant task. But if you invest in some of these other markets that may be smaller but have different growth trajectories going forward, it's certainly it's starting to pay off. And just to list a couple, you think about markets like Egypt. Egypt is our third largest overseas destination for whole soybeans. Now, a lot of people wouldn't have guessed that. I mean, China, yes. Mexico, yes. The European Union, you add it all together, that's going to be the second or third largest. But Egypt, just as a country unto itself, you wouldn't think. But it is a huge growing market, with a lot of interest and investment in poultry and aquaculture, downstream animal agricultural production, and they need beans for it. There's a preference for U.S. soy. So it's these kinds of initiatives. But it's also looking at, what are our opportunities for meal exports? And in Latin America, many countries, don't have a dedicated crush industry. So, for feeding their livestock, it's really dependent on U.S. origin soy meal. And we've seen significant growth in a number of countries. Ecuador always pops up in my mind. It's about a 500,000 ton soybean meal market for us now, driven by the strength of significant growth in their aquaculture industry. And, some of the things that our farmers invest in and that we do through our colleagues at USEC is it's international capacity building and training, the setting up of soy excellence centers to help get people in the downstream part of the industry aware of how to best utilize U.S. soy in animal rations, and really showcasing the value and opportunity for end users and buyers around the world.
Well, a few questions for you, Mac, on that front. When you guys develop new markets, you don't just develop them and say, here's your soybeans, and then get out. How are checkoff dollars helping make the new market successful?
Well, I'll give you a prime example. Last year, the U.S. soybean industry celebrated its 40th anniversary of having a presence in China. We had our first commercial shipment of soybeans to China 13 years after that. So in some of these markets, it takes time. You have to seed it. You have to develop the partnerships locally. You have to work in an integrated fashion with the rest of your global team. And you have to be weighing, trade-offs and balances, right? There's not an infinite amount of money. There's not an infinite amount of resources to deploy and address potentially every market. But, through being strategic, through taking, I'd say, a measured, staged approach, look at markets at various scales of development, available market readiness for importation of U.S. soy, looking downstream at, what their animal ag and feed sectors look like. These are all critical pieces of intelligence that we're developing, that our boots on the ground around the world work on as well. And these all factor back into the decisions that farmers make, because you don't, like you said, you don't just invest in a market for 1 year, much as a farmer is not investing in their operation for 1 year. You think about how you're going to have continuity of it, how you're going to continually grow and improve that market, or on the farm, continually advance and improve your production practices. It's all about this long-term continuum. Nobody's in this for the short term. Absolutely in it for the longer haul. And that's why we have a great group of strategically oriented farmers that are leading the investments for the checkoff.
One thing that comes to mind as we continue to have this discussion about international markets, what are some roadblocks that U.S. soy is facing when they start looking and identifying these places?
Well, there's always the geopolitical component of things, right? We had the trade war with China, and I'd say that was probably the biggest hurdle that we've had. But, for some of the more emerging and developing markets, we are seeing, some issues in 2023 that isn't unique to soy exports. Really, look at inflation last year, all right? Really high across the board. So what do countries, rich economies who have, strong central banking presences, what do you do to combat inflation? You take up your interest rates. I was looking at a chart earlier this morning of kind of that race to quell inflation, looking at all the major central banks, and U.S. federal funds rate, probably going to increase some more. We'll see. What that does is, it strengthens the currencies of those rich economies, but it also makes it a lot harder for developing markets, who, are more subject to currency weakness. Their currencies aren't the reserves of the world. It's harder from a purchasing power and ability to secure dollar-denominated commodities. So that is a definitely an economically driven short-term headwind that we're looking at. But I don't think that erodes the promise and potential of a lot of developing markets as we look forward into the future.
As we're chatting here on our USB Checkoff Chats, I want to talk about a word that we're throwing around a lot right now in agriculture, and that's sustainability. And when we look at sustainability through the lens of international markets, what are you hearing from countries that want a more sustainable product?
Well, when I hear that, I hear fantastic, because that is one of, I think, our advantages in the domestic and the international marketplace is soy sustainability profile. We've had studies done, and we've looked at, production of soy over a long-term period. And between 1980 and 2020, this is a field to market study that looks at, the resource intensivity of production. And you've seen significant reductions in the amount of area that farmers have had to dedicate to produce, a bushel of soybeans, or the amount of water that goes into it, greenhouse gas mitigation. These are all those kind of continuous on-farm practices. And moreover, there's continuous R&D investment that's happening into technology industry, some through checkoff investments, some through private sector. There's also, of course, public research as well. And, that also contributes to, continued growth there, where you can continue to grow more, but doing so in a sustainable fashion is really, really important. And as I talk with international buyers or speak to international audiences, I always feel a light bulb kind of goes off when you hear about the sustainability of U.S. soy, because you do hear about deforestation in other parts of the world, and sometimes soy all gets painted with the same brush that way. Let's look at the reality of it. You look at row crop production in the United States over the past 40 years, soybean area has come up, yes, because there have been the economic returns to incentivize additional soybean area, but it's not been bringing virgin land into production. It's been rotational shifts. It's been moving between a preference from one crop to another. So the total acre footprint across our major row crops has actually been on a decline relative to 1980, if you think about total acreage dedicated to the major row crops. So working with sustainable intensification of production and being able to validate and verify that that's being done, because you can do all these things on the farm, but if you're not able to report it out, it doesn't necessarily become a marketing advantage or something that is going to secure buyer preference. So that's why we have a thing called the Sustainable Soy Assurance Protocol, or SSAP, that are certificates that a lot of farmers are participating in around the country that basically validates the sustainable practices executed on farm to produce those soybeans. And these certificates are held by exporters in the U.S., and they can be transferred to an importer in another country, and it can be transferred up to 4 times. So if I'm a buyer overseas and I'm thinking of multiplying through or arbitraging beans or whatever, I can be secure that what I'm buying and selling is grounded in sustainable production practices through the validation and certification of that SSAP certificate.
How do you engage farmers in this conversation, trying to say, hey, this is how we share our story, while at the same time trying to have that conversation on the other end of the supply chain with purchasers?
Well, I think there are a couple interesting things, right? Because, farmers are buyers of inputs, they're sellers of outputs, right? And the same thing is true of people further downstream. There's a lot of shared dilemmas that are out there. I think about, when we've had supply tightness, and I'll talk to international buyers and say, we're trying to procure more food grade soybeans, and a lot of that is contracted years in advance. So we're like, forward contracting really, really matters. And just like with farmers, like last year when fertilizer prices were sky high and availability was really tight in late 21 and early 22, some farmers weren't able to get fertilizer. So the most expensive input you can have is the one that you're not able to secure. And if you're not able to secure it, you're not able to produce, and that's very expensive in terms of foregone opportunity. Now, in terms of talking to producers about sustainability, I think topically, I think it's an easy discussion, because it's like, well, these are the right things we've been doing, but telling your story and what you do on farm is absolutely critical. Being able to reach consumer markets who, might not have an appreciation of where food comes from or how production agriculture works. Showcasing a farm and telling a story is so critical and important. I'm from the East Coast. I've lived in cities pretty much my whole life before moving to the Midwest almost a decade ago. And, so I grew up dislocated from really understanding where, my food was. But once you go out and you meet a farmer and you learn about the production practices, and you learn about the whole supply chain and value chain that is needed and the intricacies of it to actually bring a product to market, to bring it to your retail shelves, you see how complicated it is. But you also become incredibly grateful for the fact that you can have that, and that in the US at least, it can be done and grown in a sustainable way.
Mac, those are my questions for you. If somebody wants to learn more about how checkoff dollars are being used for international markets, what's the best place to find out more information?
Absolutely. I'll give you a couple links here. So first, check out unitedsoybean.org. So that's the Checkoff website. You can see profiles of some of our farmers, as well as our strategic plan, the focus areas into which we're investing. I think you'll be hearing about that from some of our other farmers as well. So unitedsoybean.org. But on the international marketing side, check out usec.org. They are our partner in international marketing that works around the world. We exported soy to over 80 countries last year, or soy in some form to over 80 countries, and a lot of that being driven by that hard work of that USEC team. So really encourage you to check out their site as well, see some of the initiatives, learn about the Soy Excellence Centers and the things that are being done for capacity building around the world, because again, it's not just about feeding someone today, or it's not about giving someone a fish or giving someone a chicken. The old adage, teach a man to fish. Well, we think that through Soy Excellence Centers and other forms of technical transfer, we're teaching people how to use soy.
Mac, appreciate the time. Great conversation.
Thank you very much, Kellen. Enjoy the rest of the show.
Appreciate it. That's Mac Marshall with USB. I'm Kellen Avican with Brownfield Ag News. That's been another episode of our United Soybean Board Checkoff Chat.